Take notes on Roman numeral 5, reform movements in the Gilded Age. The overall scope and idea of this set of lecture notes is that as America becomes more urbanized, as cities continue to grow, we're going to see poverty result in cities, alcoholism, immigration is going to be big, so we're going to see overcrowding. And so when we talk about reform in the Gilded Age between 1865 to about 1890, we're going to see it's primarily an urban reform movement. People are going to see these squalid living conditions, and they're going to say, we should do something to make these conditions better. So a lot of the reforms we're going to be talking about in today's lecture deal with urban environments. So just like we talked about in earlier reform movements, especially in the antebellum reform movements, religion is a major factor of causing people to want to reform. They see that Christianity demands that they help their common man, and so they'll go out and they'll try to help other people the way they feel they're commanded by Jesus to do so. So letter A, religious reform. The first one we're going to talk about is a reform movement that started by Walter Rauschenbach and Washington Gladden. It's really the only time we're going to need to know their names in this course. And what they come up with is a reform movement called the social gospel. I chose this picture that you see on the screen. They believe that if you are walking down the street and you see a bunch of homeless men who are without food, without shelter, one of them, you should think of them as one of them could be Jesus, as we see in this picture. And Jesus wants you to help your fellow man. And so the social gospel says that middle and upper class people have a Christian responsibility to go into the city and to help the homeless, help the people who are starving, clothe the people who are poor. And so they believe in handouts. This, of course, contradicts the gospel of wealth that Andrew Carnegie said. He also said you have a responsibility to help the poor, but he said you have to help them help themselves. Open up a school, a university, a library, help them go get their own betterment. But the social gospel says, forget that. These people need to eat today, and so you should give them soup today. And so that is the social gospel. So we see two examples of the social gospel that come out at this time. One is the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association. Again, we see the impact of religion here. The Young Men's Christian Association, or the YMCA, what they're going to do is they're going to go into an inner city, a poor neighborhood. They're going to create a building that has a gymnasium and invite young men who are homeless or jobless off the streets and come in. We'll give you a room to live in. We'll give you food to eat, and we will give you a place where you can get physically fit. We can give you classes and learn how to speak English. You can be intellectually fit. And of course, we'll also teach you the gospel so you can be spiritually fit. And so it's a movement to go out there and help those less fortunate in cities. Then the next organization that's an example of the social gospel is something that will start across the sea, across the Atlantic in Europe, and then eventually make its way to America. It's the idea that people should be literally an army for God. The Salvation Army. They wear uniforms, they have ranks, and they will go out into society and hand out food, find people shelter, those kinds of things. And so we see in this picture, of course, in many of the reform movements, just like we saw in the antebellum reform movements, we're going to see many women join the cause as part of their kind of an extension of the cult of domesticity. Now, while the cult of domesticity says women should stay in the home because they're nurturing and caring, we see that some women say, I'm nurturing and caring, but I want to do more. I want to go outside the home and let me nurture and care to society as a whole. So even though this is not the cult of domesticity, it's still much, in some ways, inspired by that it's this traditional role of women, except now they're taking it out into society. Next part. This is still kind of dealing with religion. We saw in the antebellum period, Charles Darwin comes up with the idea of evolution. He says scientifically, he posits that you can see evolution occurring in the natural world. Well, it's not long before people take that idea of evolution and apply it to human society. And so what we get is we get this idea that humans are affected by evolution as well, and so there is going to be a split in the religious community in America because of evolution. Some Christians are going to reject Charles Darwin because they say if it's not in the Bible, it's not right, and so they will reject this new way of thinking about the world and humans in it. Other Christians will say, you know what, we see some value in this science, and so we're going to embrace it. Yes, we still believe in the Bible and the story of creation, but maybe evolution is a tool that God uses to help guide natural selection. And so we see these two things. And so the Christian community in America gets split between modernists, who try to incorporate the idea of evolution into their religion, and then we get fundamentalists who say no, evolution is not in the Bible. We need a fundamental interpretation of the Bible, or a literal interpretation of the Bible. So just like in the First and Second Great Awakening, we see that religious communities are once again getting split by new developments in society. And then, as I was saying just a few minutes ago, that eventually we take this idea of evolution and apply it to human society. So in the Gilded Age, we're seeing these large wealth gaps develop between the super rich, the captains of industry, and everybody else. And as that wealth gap widens, we talked about various views of wealth. Is it okay for some people to have a lot of wealth and a lot of people to not have a lot of wealth? And we've talked about the social gospel. We've talked about the gospel of wealth. Those are all views of society. Horatio Alger's From Rags to Riches story. These are all ways of looking at wealth and how it's accumulated, and is that a good thing? Well, William Graham Sumner, he comes up with the idea of social Darwinism. It's the idea that, evolution also happens in the human society. And so the reason people are rich is because they have better DNA makeup. They are a superior form of human being, and the people who are low that we see groveling in the picture, they have something wrong with their DNA, and this social wealth gap is just evolution, and the rich people should be celebrated because they are the next step of humanity, and the poor people should not be helped. So they certainly disagree with the social gospel and the gospel of wealth, people who believe in social Darwinism. You should not help poor people because you're really harming the human race if you let these poor people survive and continue. If they die out because they're too poor, that's just natural selection, and the human race will be better for it. So this is a very different view of wealth that we see developing during the Gilded Age. Next, women. Now, as I said before in Section A, women are going to be once again in reform movements. We also see women gaining more and more economic opportunities. And so we're going to start by talking about lower class women or lower middle class women. We see all kinds of new careers open up for them. And in part, it's because of the business community. We have said that overall consolidation is happening in businesses. Businesses, through competition, are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so there's going to be a large corporate organization where we need to have women. And so we see this idea of the office secretary develop. Before the Gilded Age, most secretaries were men. They kept appointments. They wrote down memos. It was a high status position to some extent. But now with corporations getting bigger and bigger and bigger, we're going to see we need an army of people to write memos from one part of the company that's really big to another. And of course, this is all aided by the invention, as we said previously, of the typewriter. And so we're going to see thousands of women enter the workforce as office secretaries typing. Now, the reason this is women now instead of men is typing is not a laborious task. It's not physically demanding as far as lifting something. It's not dangerous. And so we thought that it was a career suitable for women. And so we see women more and more take on this role of being a secretary. What we see in the picture is a switchboard operator. With the development of the telephone, we need a way to physically connect the person who's calling to the person who's receiving the call. It's on an electric circuit. And so the switchboard operator, you can see right here, she is physically closing the circuit between the person who makes the call and the person who receives the call. And so again, we see women take this role because, one, they get paid less than men. Two, it's not a laborious job. And so women's employers want to hire women because they can get paid less. And then three, we see women doing this because telephone companies found out that their customers preferred a woman's voice. It was more soothing, it was less gruff, and it made the telephone call more enjoyable because when you place the call, you talked to her and she then would connect you to the correct place that you would go, so you would always be talking with the switchboard operator. We see this in today's world in America where Siri is a woman. People, they want to have a more friendly experience, and so we see women fill that role. And then, of course, as we see industry grow and production grow, we're going to see the development of these things called department stores, where you can go in and the store doesn't sell just one thing. It sells many things. It's divided into departments. And so you have a ladies' apparel section, and you have a men's apparel section, and then you may have a dishware department. We see this at Marshall Field's today, or J.C. Penney's, or something like that. And so we see these big kind of shopping areas develop. And so there's a demand for more laborers, and again, this is not a very difficult physical job, and you can pay women less for this, and so we see women go into these ideas of retail clerks. And so as businesses grow and new technology occurs, we see more and more and more, certainly lower class women have more economic opportunities to support themselves. Whenever you get economic opportunity, you also get social freedom. If you're a woman who's living in the city and you get your own paycheck, that means that a man can't tell you what to do. You're not living with your father. He's maybe back on a farm or back in an old country. And so you can kind of determine your own life. Your husband or your father, your brother, you don't depend on them to put food on your table. You're putting food on your table since you have one of these new jobs. And so we see women are able to have more social freedom. They're able to go out in society, leave the cult of domesticity, and have what they would consider probably more fun, or at least experience more things. So that leads us to a new view of morality. Victoria Woodhull, she's seeing these changes in women. Women have been leading reform movements. Women are increasingly going in the workforce. And she said women should continue on. We should view women differently. And so she advocates for something called the new morality. She says that women do not have to, in part, she says that women do not have to be married to have sex. They can have sex outside of the married life. It's their life. They can control their own sexual urges if they want to, and so we see that this is something that she's advocating for women to do. Of course, not very many women follow this. It's pretty radical, and there is going to be a pushback from men. And so we see Anthony Comstock, who is a member of Congress, and he helps Congress pass this thing called the Comstock Law. It's a reaction against this new morality and also seeing women more and more out in society and getting away from the cult of domesticity. And people are very concerned about what they see as, loosening morality in America. And so the Comstock Law gives the federal government the power to go through your mail and to search it. And if they find anything that they think is not moral, that's advocating this new morality, or is, protesting against the cult of domesticity, they can destroy your mail. Of course, this is a violation of your First Amendment rights, but society at this time is trying to struggle with this new view of women, and they felt it was appropriate to empower the government to go and go through your mail to try to clamp down on the spread of these new ideas for women. Next, we have women in reform. As I said, women are definitely going to be part of leading in the reform movement. And one of these women is named Jane Addams, with 2 Ds. Jane Addams, once again, we're going to see an idea develop in Europe, just like the Salvation Army, and then be copied by Americans. And Jane Addams, she finds out about this reform movement. It's called the Settlement House movement. It's where middle and upper class women who want to go leave the cult of domesticity and go out and nurture and take care of society, what they do is they go into an immigrant neighborhood, a poor neighborhood. They buy up an old derelict mansion, maybe from bygone days, and they convert it into a community center of sorts. And they live in this community center, and they invite the immigrant women and their children in. And they provide services that is going to allow these poor immigrant women to have a better life, a better chance at success. And so they'll provide daycare for the immigrant children so their moms can go and get a job and help support the family, so to bring more money into the family. They'll provide English classes, they'll provide health services for some of these immigrant women and their children. And so again, it's an effort in urban America to try to make the poor people's lives a little bit better. Of course, and the name of her settlement house in Chicago was called Hull House. Next, we see Florence Kelley, who is going to be a strong advocate trying to end child labor. We see with all of this industrialization, factories and owners are going to try to hire as many children as they possibly can, because for 2 reasons. Children work for less. Nobody's expecting a child to have to earn enough money to take care of a whole family. And so we see child laborers get paid very, very little amounts, and also children can fit into tiny places that adults can't, whether that's crawling inside a working machine in a factory and fixing something, or putting another bobbin on some kind of a textile mill, or maybe going into a coal mine and crawling into places that adults couldn't go to. And so there were many benefits for hiring children as laborers. And so Florence Kelly says this isn't right. She looked at pictures of maybe this 8-year-old, 9-year-old kid in this factory, and she says this kid should be in a school, he should be getting an education, he should be in a healthier and safer environment, so he has a chance in life. He's not always doomed to work in a factory or a mine. And so she leads the movement to get rid of child labor. She also advocates for women in the workforce too, trying to get rid of sweatshops. And so we see in the bottom left-hand picture is a sweatshop. It's in the textile industry, and these women are working on sewing machines, and they're trying to put together clothes, and they get paid. In a sweatshop, you get crammed into a factory space, and they pay you by the piece. In other words, you don't get an hourly wage, but you get paid for how much you produce. So there's just tremendous pressure to produce as much as you possibly can, which leads to accidents, women having needles run through their fingers, getting their hands caught in some kind of machine or whatever. And so we see that this is a very dangerous working condition. Plus, they sometimes lock the doors so that women wouldn't take breaks. They want them to produce as much as possible. So it's very dangerous. If there's a fire, the women could get trapped. And so she says that this isn't right. Either women should be at home in the cult of domesticity, or women should be going and at least being treated to safer, better working conditions. And so we see her as a pioneer trying to help women and children in the workforce. Florence Kelly. Next, Women in Reform continued. We're going to see once again women as leaders of the temperance movement. If you remember, before the Civil War, we had temperance trying to get rid of alcohol in society, and so we see it after the Civil War reemerge in the form of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. You can see it in the picture there. Women are drawn to this cause because they see that a lot of the problems that face women are caused by their husbands drinking. Either poverty because their husband is drinking and gets fired from a job, or a spousal abuse or child abuse, or all of these things that happen when people get addicted to alcohol and become alcoholics. And so they said we can cure all of these societal ills if we just convince men to give up drinking alcohol. And so what we see in the picture on the left is women using peer pressure, public humiliation. They stand outside of a bar or a billiard hall and they heckle men as they go in and say, you should be home taking care of your children and wife, or you should be going getting a job. And so that way the men won't go into the pool hall and they won't go get drunk. And so we see this is going to be a continuing idea of this need to get rid of alcohol in society to try to make everything better, and women will continue to play an important role in that. Women's suffrage. Again, we compare it to pre-Civil War or antebellum America. Women, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the pre-Civil War era, they said at Seneca Falls, if you remember in 1848, that women should be given the right to vote because women are equal to men. And that went nowhere. If you remember, it got consumed by the abolition movement. And so after the Civil War, women realized that they're never going to get civil rights, or at least not anytime soon, if they say that men and women are equal, because society just didn't believe that at the time. And so we have women like Carrie Chapman Catt become these new suffragettes. They change course. They say that the way to get women the right to vote is to play on men's stereotypes of women. And so men believe that women are weaker, when men believe that women are more caring and nurturing than men are. And so Carrie Chapman Catt says, well, let's use that to get the right to vote. We see all of these problems happening in society that we've mentioned. And so there is men as well as women believe that we should pass laws, we should reform, we should try to fix society. And so Carrie Chapman Catt and her counterparts, they say, well, let's use that. So they go to the men and they say, women are more caring. You agree with that? And the men say, yes, we do. They're more concerned about society. You agree with that? And the men would say, yes, we do. And she said, because of that, that's why we should give women the right to vote. Not because we're equal, but because we're more caring. And so we see women change tactics a little bit to try to get themselves the right to vote. You should give us the right to vote, not because we're equal, but because we're more caring and nurturing, and we will try to fix society if you give us the right to vote. And this, of course, starts to work. We see women start to get the right to vote during the Gilded Age at the state and local level. Not at the national level. That will happen in a different time period. But if we look at this map, for the most apart, you notice that Western states give women the right to vote first. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that out west, we see very few women. There are some women, but they're, mostly men moved west. And so some of these states want to draw more women to the west. It's going to have, if women come out west, then men will settle down, they'll have families, we'll have more permanent settlement, not people moving in to get rich and then leaving. And so it'll help a lot of these territories become states. But also we see women get the right to vote because, let's pretend we're in Colorado and you're a homesteader, you're a farmer on the frontier. A man and a wife had to work as a team together in this very harsh environment to try to bring in enough crops to feed the family. And so men and women, to some extent, already saw themselves as equal on the farm, and so it wasn't much of a leap to convince Western men to give women the right to vote because they depended on them so much on those farms out west. And so for those two reasons, we see that mostly Western states give women the right to vote first. Certainly Wyoming is the first territory in 1869 that gave women the right to vote. Next. So we've talked about new morality for women. Well, now we're going to talk about a new view of women that's a little bit less risque. And so we see in magazines that are geared toward women, in the advertisements, we see a new image of women emerge to try to attract customers to women to buy their magazine, to buy their clothes. And what we see is a more athletic, outgoing woman that starts to emerge in these magazine ads. And the magazine at the time that kind of pioneered this was Gibson magazine. And so this woman that is an outdoors woman who's rejecting the cult of domesticity to some extent, who's going out there, you see in the picture she's playing golf with men, unchaperoned, is known as the Gibson girl or the new woman. And so again, most women don't leave the cult of domesticity for this, but we do have an alternate view of womanhood. Certainly she's respectable, but she's maybe not as respectable as the cult of domesticity, but she is being a little risque. She's going out there. She's not embracing the new morality, but she is out more in society, out doing athletic things. And so we see morals and standards of women's behavior start to change a little bit here in the Gilded Age. Now, lower class women that are working women, they are not doing the new morality. They are certainly not doing the new woman. They have to work. So here we see women canning shrimp in this factory, and they are not going to have the free time to go out and play golf or to think about new morality. So really, most of the changes we've talked about for women, this new morality or this new woman, women leading reform movements, those are all for middle and upper class women that have some of the education and certainly the economic opportunity to have some free time to go do these things. Lower class women are still going to be working on the farm or in factories. So that's it for women. Let's talk now about African Americans. Certainly African Americans are going to want reform movements as well. During the Gilded Age, so when we have the Gilded Age going on at this time from 1865 to 1900 up north with factories and industrialization and immigration, at the same time that's going on, if you remember from our previous unit, we have Reconstruction and Redemption going down south. And most African Americans are still in the South, and they are suffering through sharecropping. They're very poor. If you remember, they're always in debt to the white owners of land. If you remember, also we talked about the Jim Crow laws and segregation. We see African Americans treated as second-class citizens who have almost no economic opportunity and no civil rights. Even though, of course, we've changed the Constitution in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, African Americans in reality are not being allowed to vote because of literacy tests and poll taxes. And so some African Americans are going to come to the forefront and say, hey, we need African American reform too. But they disagree on how to get better lives for African Americans. So Booker T. Washington, you see him in the picture talking to a crowd of African Americans. He says, you know what, in our lifetime, we're not going to get political equality. White people are, at this current time, they're not going to treat us as equals in the law. They're certainly not going to let us vote in any kind of large numbers. And we just can't change that right now. But what we can change is how we put food on the table. And so he says that the way for African Americans to improve their lives now is to go get training, get education. If you can get better educated, then you can get better, higher paying jobs. And that's going to help you and your wives and your children have a better life because you can afford food. You can afford better rent. You can maybe get your children educated. And so he says the path to improving African Americans' lives now is through technical training and education. Now, he is severely disagreed with by W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois says, you know what, I don't believe in that. He says he disagrees with Booker T. Washington. He says African Americans should not go down the economic path, but really focus on getting political equality now. So they fundamentally disagree on the path to take to help African Americans. He says that African Americans are never going to get ahead in America unless they can, write, even though they can vote, even though they're allowed to. Technically, of course, we know they're not physically allowed to. And so he says we need political equality now. Once we get political equality, we can vote, we can hold office, we can make lives better for ourselves through the government. And so that's what he's advocating. And he creates the NAACP to do that, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And it's an organization that he helps found to organize African Americans to go demand their political civil rights. Now, he knows that most African Americans are not going to be able to go out and give speeches and lead rallies and organize protests because they're stuck sharecropping or they're in some low-paying job up north and they don't have enough education. And so he says that the talented 10th, the top 10% of African Americans that are educated and well off, what they have is a responsibility to go out, join the NAACP, and start making speeches, start drawing attention to their cause, and putting pressure on the government to give them more rights in America. And so his talented 10th. So we see Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois disagreeing about reform. So we're going to put reform on the back burner for a little while. We're going to finish up this lecture by talking about art and entertainment. It's on the rise in America. We see Americans have more and more and more what we call leisure time, free time. Now, in previous lectures, I've certainly talked about that most workers are working 8 or 10 to 12-hour days, and they're very dangerous conditions, and all of that, of course, is true. But that's still going to be less working time than many farmers. Farmers have to work from before sunup to well after sundown. And so when people move to the city, even if they do work 10 hours a day, 11 hours a day, that is probably less than what a farmer was putting in. And so we see free time go up in urban environments. Certainly their working conditions are harder and more dangerous, but people in factories will have more free time and probably get paid more than farmers too. So we see people with free time and with a little bit more money, and that of course is going to lead to entertainment. People are going to want to have something to entertain them on their free time. So we're going to start off with the media. We see this thing, the newspapers. People are going to have more and more time to read the newspapers. They're going to have more money to buy a newspaper, and even the cost of newspapers are coming down because of new developments in printing technology. And so we see papers for a penny, so we get the penny press. So more and more Americans want to read the newspaper, and if you remember, education reform is going on in the antebellum period, and so more and more Americans are educated, so they can read the newspaper. And so the newspaper business becomes a big business to go get people's money and to get them to buy the newspaper. And so now remember, a newspaper is supposed to be journalistic. They're supposed to go and give you fair and unbiased news, the facts. But that's not how you sell a lot of newspapers. Newspapers are businesses, and they need to make a profit. And the way to do that is to sell newspapers. And so we see this thing called sensationalistic or yellow journalism developing at this time. It is to try to take the news and jazz it up a little bit, or slightly alter the facts, or emphasize some facts over others that make it scandalous, that make it interesting to hear about. Today we see this either on CNN or Fox News. What they do is they say everything's a crisis, or breaking news. This gets people interested in what's going on, so they watch the local news, or they'll watch Fox or CNN. And the newspapers did the same thing. They try to make things as exciting as possible so that people will buy their newspapers. And so we see this term yellow journalism appear. Now there are two big newspaper, we call them robber barons in other industries, newspaper giants here. They're going to dominate a lot of the newspaper industry in America. We have Joseph Pulitzer, who the Pulitzer Prize will be named after, and William Randolph Hearst. And they're competing with each other to have more and more outlandish stories to get people to buy their newspaper over their competitors. It's called yellow journalism because in some of these sensationalistic newspapers, they have the comic strip with this kid named the Yellow Kid. And so he was appearing in a lot of these sensationalistic newspapers, and so they started to call them yellow journalism. Next, under more about reading, we see that there's going to be a whole series of authors that come at this time that are highlighting through their books some of the issues that people are concerned about in the day. And so we see Henry George. He writes a book called Progress and Poverty, and he is saying that there is a wealth gap in America and how horrible this is. And he comes up with a solution to fix the wealth gap. What we'll do is we'll give a tax, an increasingly high tax on land, to the richest Americans, and then take their money and redistribute it among the poor. And that's how he tries to do the wealth gap, close the wealth gap. Next, we see a book called Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. He's also commenting on what's going on in society. And it's a book about this man who falls asleep in the Gilded Age, and he wakes up in the future. And what has happened over time while he was sleeping is that businesses continue to consolidate and consolidate and consolidate and compete. So there's only one corporation in America, and that corporation has either overtaken the government or the government overtook it, but everybody works for one big company. And he sees this as a positive because everybody works for this company, i.e. the government, and everybody has a job, everybody has an income, everybody eats in this common cafeteria, there's healthcare, and so eventually monopoly comes out to be a good thing because all the workers are employed, there's full employment, and everybody is taken care of. So this is how we see the future fixing some of the inequality in society. Next, we see Mark Twain. Mark Twain is writing mostly about the South and some of the things that he sees happening in the South. A lot about class and race relationships, whether Mark Twain or Huckleberry Finn, and he's using his books in a humorous approach often to poke fun of and highlight some of the problems he sees in Southern society. Next, we see Frank Norris, and he writes a book called The Octopus. What it really is, it comes out as a series of newspaper articles. It's an expose. He's highlighting some of the evils or the bad parts about railroads in America. He says that railroads have a monopoly over trade, and they're using their monopoly to drive farmers out of business. And so he's highlighting a problem that he sees in society is what all of these people are doing in their books. And last, we see other forms of entertainment. We see Wild West shows develop. As we're going to find in our next set of notes, the West is rapidly disappearing. It's being settled by more and more and more farmers. And so Native Americans are disappearing. These battles out West are going to start to become less and less. And so there is a market out East for people to find out about Native Americans and cowboys and all of that. And so Buffalo Bill, what he does is he creates kind of a circus with Wild West theme. He rounds up a couple of Native Americans and he says, if you'd like to get off the reservation, come with me. And they go touring cities of the East and they put on mock Native American and cowboy battles. They have trick shot artists like Annie Oakley. They have people roping cows, doing all kinds of stunts, and this really is exciting for people because they get to feel like they're seeing in the Wild West. And so it's an example of people spending their leisure time and money on entertainment. Next, we see this thing called vaudeville. Vaudeville is variety shows that develop in the cities of the East, mostly New York and Jewish communities, in Jewish sections of the city. And it's a variety show, and so vaudeville might go where you have a comedian come on the stage, and then they'll be followed by some ladies who are dancing, and then they'll be followed by a ventriloquist, and maybe some acrobats or something like that. And so we see vaudeville as a form of early entertainment for people in cities. Next, we see several participatory sports that start. And these are not necessarily spectator sports yet. They will develop into them, but not yet. And so people start to play baseball in their free time. Baseball starts before the Civil War in America, but will get more and more and more popular as people find out that they like the game. And eventually it will become something that's a spectator sport, but not quite yet. Next, another sport that invented in America is basketball. At a local YMCA, we see basketball being invented, and this gives people something to do indoors. Baseball is in the summer, basketball is in the wintertime. It gives them something to do indoors in their leisure time to get physically fit. And perhaps the biggest craze of all at this time for entertainment was bicycling. People they would go out and they would buy bicycles, and it would give young people freedom. They could, on their free time, get away from their parents, get away from their dreary working or living conditions, and they could pedal to the beach. They could go out and have a picnic away from adult supervision, and it became kind of an escapist way of just dealing with your time and going and getting out of the city and experiencing some fresh air. So all of these are examples of how Americans started to spend their free time, and again, they're mostly in cities.